Okay, in the introductory slideshow, I talked to you about the transition that you're making from 101 to 102. In 101, I ask you to develop your personal writer's voice, and you worked on that significantly all semester, working through various formats and types of essays, but they were all in your personal voice. And I told you that to be successful in this class, you and to use what you learn here in all of your subsequent classes, your literature survey classes, history survey classes, any class where they ask you to write a written response to something that you're learning, you are going to have to learn to develop your academic voice and style. But it's going to be a challenge. um, this voice, this academic voice that you're going to be working on, you're going to have to learn to read critically and without bias. So you don't choose a side. You're kind of like a scientist examining an artifact. You're picking out all these elements that you're going to be learning about, the author's tone, the mood, the choices, the word choices, the language, all of those things. You're going to be examining them like a scientist, critically and without bias. You're going to have to look for patterns and common features in text, and make text-to-text connections with things that you've read previously, other texts that you are familiar with, the Bible, text that you've read before, and then text to and connections to the world outside. So then you have to take all that, those findings that you're making as a scientist, reading critically, and you have to be able to articulate them in your writing. So this screencast is to give you a little bit more information about developing your academic voice, shifting away from that personal voice and developing your academic voice and style. And the two styles are very different. This handout is actually probably one of the most useful things that you'll get from me all semester long. It may be worth your while to print it out so that you will have, and then print out a copy of the rubric, because the rubric is based off of the things that are listed here. So let's just go through some general guidelines. Third person is going to be your safest bet. I want you to omit completely the use of second person you and use first person I sparingly. I would recommend that you do not use it at all. Stick with third person. It's the safest bet. Your tone should be confident. That's not cocky, it's confident, knowledgeable, curious, fair-minded, careful, intelligent, and studied. Avoid sounding like some arrogant, pseudo-intellectual know-it-all. You're not trying to prove that you know more about the subject than anybody else, which is not true. You don't. And that's not me just kind of slamming you. That's, you want to avoid sounding that way to your reader. And instead, being intelligent, being studied, and knowledgeable about what you're presenting. Your diction, that's your choice of words. Please include words that you're comfortable using. Don't use a thesaurus just to use your big words and sound smart. Those $5 words. You want to use your words correctly. Literary terms for this unit, and I'm going to give you a glossary that you'll have at your disposal. Use them correctly. Assume that your reader knows the meaning of the term, so you don't have to define, what tone is for your audience. However, use those definitions in a way that helps you explain your meaning or what you're trying to argue. Your language should be straightforward and simple. Don't be flowery, lofty, or poetic. Stick to the text, stick to your analysis, be intelligent, be knowledgeable, and be careful that it's not overkill. Don't get emotionally involved with your author, your subject, You don't want to take an emotional stance. Again, it's a very detached and unbiased stance of what you're writing about. Remain analytical. You're the scientist examining a specimen. Okay? Always write about literature in the present tense. It doesn't matter how many years ago it happened. You write about it in the present tense as it's happening. Okay? You're going to make the distinction between speaker and poet, and author and narrator. Not all poems are written with the poet's voice. They use different personalities, different speakers. It's not the same. And the same thing with your short stories and your plays. The author is not always the narrator. So be careful that you don't get those confused. In the very first introduction, you're going to identify the authors by their first and last name. But then subsequently in the rest of the essay, you're going to refer to the author by his or her, or authors by his or her last name. An example of this is Plath uses elements of her own life in the poem Daddy. Don't refer to the author by the first name or using the title Miss, Mrs., Mr., Mrs., any of those things. You're going to want to avoid contractions. That was pretty standard last semester. No contractions in formal writing. Avoid pats on the back. Don't talk about how great the poem is or how great the story is or how great the author did a job of this. You're analyzing. This is not a book review or a story review or a poem review. Avoid announcing what your paper will do. In this paper, I will show that in lines 44 to 45, he discusses, do not discuss what the author or poet wants us, the reader, to know. Okay? Avoid slang, colloquial language. That's like Southern language in your writing. Now, if it's in your quotes that you're pulling from the text, that's different. But you want to avoid slang and colloquial, cliche, and text speak in your own diction that you use to write. Avoid weak language that makes you sound unsure of yourself. In my opinion, seems, kind of, must have to me. I think, I feel, maybe, might, possibly, likely, kind of. You want to avoid that. That's weak language. And then that also falls back to that whole idea that you want to eliminate the use of first person. And that's your me's and my's and I's, okay? Asking rhetorical questions. Sometimes we think that's a really good way to start a paper. Why is the speaker angry with her father? How would you feel in this situation? You want to avoid that altogether. Stick with the text, stick with the analysis, getting it down on paper without asking rhetorical questions of your reader. You want to avoid sweeping generalizations. This is probably a term, you haven't actually heard the term itself, but you know what it is. You've used them before in your personal writing. All women know, all students like, mothers love their children, or introductory statements that open up to all people in today's society, throughout time, fathers and daughters. Avoid that. Just focus on the text. Avoid summarizing the text without analysis or summarizing the writer's life with no quotes to support ideas. Okay, those are those big no-nos that you're going to want to avoid in using your academic voice and style.